welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name's Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and we'd like to thank Backscatter for sponsoring this episode. Backscatter are an underwater imaging retailer with a huge inventory of cameras, housings, ports, lights, strobes, arms, everything you could want for underwater imaging. So please head on over to backscatter.com to check out what they do. I'm very happy to be joined by Alex. Hey, Alex.
Hi, Adam.
Nice to see you.
Here.
And I thought what I would do is I'd drop you in the deep end of this episode and ask you to define what makes an iconic image. There we are. Not more than 2,000 words. Please explain.
Yeah, well, I know why you're asking me this, because we've been talking about some of Wetpixel's history, and I'll come back to that in a second or two. But I think, iconic images are defined really, by the individual, by the community, by society. It's less about what's in the frame, and I think more about how that image has lived in people's consciousness. I think it's a more, I can't think of quite the right word, but it's a more permanent achievement than just simply being a viral image.
Yes,
I think a viral image is something that's everywhere for a day and everyone sees it, and it's gone the next day. I think an iconic image is one that everyone sees it, but it lives on in people's consciousness as something that resonates with them. And it may not be an image they love. You can definitely have, a lot of conservation images can be very iconic, but they're not images that you want to look at, but you can't forget them. I think it's the social aspect of it is for me, really a really important part of it. Perhaps more so than any other. And I think, the moment, you ask anyone, think of some iconic underwater images, the right answer are the images that pop into your head.
Yes, absolutely.
Pictures that, I think come up time and time again in these pictures are, Brian Skerry's photo of Mauricio Handler meeting the right whale. Is an iconic underwater image. David Dublay's image of Dina Halstead surrounded by the circle of barracuda is an iconic underwater image. And there are many newer ones, in fact. Quite interestingly, during lockdowns, I was running online classes, and one of those classes, or 1 week in the series, we talked about composition. As part of the homework for that, I asked people to share their favorite underwater images. Impressing on them, they weren't allowed to choose any I'd taken, and they weren't allowed to choose, and there was no right or wrong answer apart from that. And it was really interesting to see which images come along. And generally, I would say the underwater photography community has quite short memory. In fact, we're going to cast our minds back to what feels like a different age in a minute when we dive into Wetpixel. So I think, but iconic images are those ones that have that community resonance to stay with us. I don't feel that there's any, specific technique that leads to that. But I think as we dive into it, there's clearly elements of it. They're usually created by someone who is, on top of everything technically, is probably photographing something that isn't every day, and then something special occurs in that opportunity, whether it's them doing something unusual technique-wise or something unusual unfolding in front of them that allows them to create something really, really special. Sometimes they are fortuitous. Sometimes I think they come about because the photographer has recognized something and has gone back and shot it. And certainly the way that I've heard David Duboulay, for example, talk about the barracuda shot, the swirling barracuda shot, is the way I think I've heard him tell the story is on one dive, he was the diver, found himself completely surrounded by barracuda and thought, this is amazing experience, but I can't shoot it from here. And it was actually then they went back and he photographed Dinah Halstead swimming in amongst the barracuda to tell the story of the emotional thing that he'd experienced. And we all tell slightly different story. I don't know how, that's the story I've heard him tell. I don't know if it happened exactly like that. It may well have done. I'm not casting any aspersion. I'm just saying that, over time. So I think that is a really important aspect of it. But I think what I would like to do is, I know that we had lots of discussions about this in the, in Wetpixel, probably more than a decade ago now. And I
Yeah, yeah.
think a prominent Wetpixel member that both of us knew and know and liked very much was Steve Williams. And I know he started several threads on this subject. And I was looking at one of them earlier, and he references some talk I gave, which is long vanished into. I've given a lot of talks on underwater photography. But he
Yeah.
says that I gave some talk that he saw online or something that dealt with this subject, and I don't remember that talk. I might have a quick look for it in a minute. But he did, for his talk, try to create a flowchart graphic for it, which maybe we can dig out and put on screen, which was
Yeah,
called the
yeah.
Path to Treasure.
Here it
And
is, and I think important, just to preface, Steve's an engineer, so he likes things that work in straight corners and
mm,
don't have wiggles on them. So this graph took quite a long time to generate, and it started off with straight lines on it, ended up going with more wiggles, which I thought was telling, really. But Steve did a lot of kind of exploration of the idea of what creates an iconic image, and how to try and define what that means.
mm,
And I think this graph is a really interesting way of trying to define it.
So yeah, so I mean, he's sort of, it's a little bit as your, aim to be your progression as a photographer,
Mm,
in that you start off taking snapshots
mm,
with basic control of your camera, and you're just really trying to get something that looks not nice. You then progress to becoming, a competent photographer, really taking control of your lighting, exposure, focus,
mm,
and trying to create, something unique that, you've got an idea and you're trying to capture it.
mm,
I think you then create images that other people admire,
mm,
is the kind of the next stage. So you're beginning to stand out amongst your peers, and people are, drawing attention to your work. Perhaps you're using creative light, or you're absolutely nailing, the technique, particularly well. And then those images can sort of be elevated by, that you're trying to do more with the frame. You're generating more emotional impact
yeah,
by the way you're using your camera, or maybe telling an important story, and maybe timing a shot to really capture the peak of the action, or some serendipitous opportunity that occurs, and
yeah,
that sort of elevates you up into amazing images. And I think one thing that Steve's put on the graph, which I think is really good, is he talks about the early stages, you're just focused on capture,
yeah,
and as the later stages of photography, you become very much more of a communicator, that there's things that you want to say about your subjects. And I think, I talk about the word communication a lot when I teach underwater photography, and it can be a scary word.
yeah,
But what we mean by it is this: there's a reason you took that photo, and it might be that, wow, this fish is really red. It can be really simple. It doesn't need to be, oh
yeah,
yes, and this species is very threatened by this man-made
yeah,
activity, and therefore I traveled to this place and took a picture. And it can simply be, this is an amazing subject, I want to show it to you.
yeah.
Um,
And I think that I remember, again, in a thread on Wetpixel, trying to, it doesn't really matter whether you took this picture naked at 1,000 meters while holding your breath while being attacked by a cloud of piranhas. What matters is the image. What matters is what the picture looks like.
yeah,
People ultimately are not that interested in the whole kind of the process of what, or the iconic, for it to be iconic. It's not about the process of it took to create it. It's about what the image is. And I think this is an important thing. I think too often, all of us, well, certainly myself, we fall into this. It was a really difficult image to get because I had to go a long way, travel a lot, spend a lot, buy a lot of gear, whatever it may be. And actually, that's not really, there's a chance that that's going to result in an iconic image, but it's no guarantee. That doesn't make an image iconic. Um, and
yeah, and I think that images also need a platform to become iconic.
yeah, yeah. And I think
And I think that platform generally needs to be more than social media.
I'm going to quote you on this because there's a wonderful quote here. Again, Wetpixel thread about iconic
Uh,
images. And the most
but this,
important.
you have to. I'm going to preface this by, I'll get my excuses in now by saying I can't even remember the talk I gave.
Well,
about this around this time. So
so this may have been typed whilst under the influence of wine or something, but the most important point I was trying to make was that images need the right platform to become iconic. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech wouldn't have been iconic if he'd been at home on the sofa shouting at the TV, which I think is brilliant.
well,
But
I guess that does speak to the fact though that they need that
uh,
platform.
and I think it actually encapsulates it perfectly. I mean, tongue in cheek aside,
Yeah.
and I think this is one of the things that possibly is quite interesting, kind of looking at this as a theme again. You know, over a decade on from when these posts were made on Wetpixel, is that the world has changed. You know, and the way the platforms that we have that allow us to get imagery out into the public view are very different. And things like social media have dramatically impacted the way people view images. And one of the things, and this is something that I tend to find that actually people have a much shorter attention span. So in general, you know, creating an iconic image is tougher because people tend to look at things like and move on very, very quickly. Whereas you know, previously they may have been more of an engagement with an image, just purely in terms of time, possibly.
I think one thing that's also changed from this is, you know, reading this old thread from, you know, 11, 12 years ago,
Yeah,
is, you know, a point that's made quite a few places is that, you know, because it's a very international thread actually, because it being Wetpixel,
yeah,
is people are, you know, you can see that, you know, European photographers are reacting to certain type of pictures and Asian photographers are reacting to other images which are coming, and North American photographers are reacting to other images.
yeah,
And their iconic images are very much driven by what they're exposed to.
yeah,
And I think that's changed as well. In that, I think there's, you know, much more, you know, with social media. I mean, I know social media, you know, Asian photographers tend to have more Asian followers, and, you know, European photographers tend to have more European followers, etc. Driven often by time zone as much as anything.
yeah.
But I think that it's there's, you know, more, there's less cultural isolation now,
Yes, I
and
agree.
I think iconic images, you know, tend to exist more globally. And I think the publications around the world reflect that. You know, you see, you know, what John does with the output with the ADEX and the related magazines. You know, they're very international looking always,
Yeah,
and I think he's introduced that community, you know, and through the ADEX show as well, you know, to photographers from a really wide pool. So in that area of the world, you have, you know, I know he did a you know, greatest underwater photographers or something book,
yeah.
and that was very, very internationally mixed,
It
and I
was.
think really introduced people to lots of different shooters. Whereas perhaps at the time when we were writing this thread on Wetpixel, people were very much, well, these are the people who I see in my magazines or in my clubs, and there
Yeah.
was, you know, although Wetpixel existed, it wasn't so much, you know, it wasn't so international.
Yeah, there's not as much cross fertilization. I think there's less regional difference now um, between regional boundaries between shooters. You know, you mix on a much more international level. I think one of the
I'm scanning the thread here. Sorry, Adam. There's a good one here that's talks about one of my pictures in you know, what could be perceived as a negative way. But I think this really backs up the fact there's a difference between iconic images and what we now call viral images.
yeah,
And an image that I had around this time that was definitely a viral image, although they weren't really called that then,
mm,
was I did a selfie with a grey seal looking over my shoulder
yeah,
up in the Farne Islands, and that went in loads of newspapers, really went around the world, went in loads of, you know, you know, web stories about, you know, amazing selfies or amazing moments with animals, blah blah blah, and was seen, you know, just everywhere.
yeah,
But I don't consider that an iconic image. I consider it a viral image. And Go ran Trenner, who is only I don't know who that is in real life, says, you know, one of the iconic images to consider would be Dr. Mustard's selfie with curious. You can tell he doesn't know me because he calls me Dr. Mustard. With curious sea lion on his shoulder. Every time I see it somewhere on the web, it generates a big smile on my face.
mm,
Um, but in my opinion, the image doesn't meet all the criteria to be iconic, and I'd completely agree on that.
yeah. I think
I think it's very much and that was before we had the term viral. But
yeah,
you know, people could see that there was that difference between iconic and viral, which I think is really, you know, there is a difference.
I think there's also there's an interesting in Steve's graph. He obviously he has this curving line that goes from snapshots to good photographs to admired images to amazing
Mm.
images, and I think there's an interesting corollary there in terms of process. I think, well, maybe I should ask the question: which are competition winners? Which slot do they fit into, Alex?
I think it depends a bit on the competition.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt that I think some of the more recent underwater photos that I would say have become iconic because they've become well known in our community through competitions.
Yes.
And the name of the photographer escapes me, which is really bad. But there's a photo that we awarded in UPY that's been in other competitions as well, which is, and I think it's a French photographer. Just the name's gone out my head while we're live. It's a picture of a female humpback taken from behind, and it's a perfectly symmetrical shot of the tail of the female humpback. And on one side, there's the pup, the calf looking at the female. On the other side of the frame, there's a free diver. And
Yeah.
it's a very well-known shot, and many people know. And I think that's a picture that's very iconic in our community.
Yeah.
When I was doing the class and asking people to share favorite images, that picture was mentioned by every single class
Yeah.
as a picture that everyone really resonates as an icon. And that's a relatively modern underwater image that I think has reached that level.
I think it's an interesting one because apart from the actual moment of composition, but actually it's a relatively simple compositional shot. The piece has just had to be in the right place at the right time. You didn't have a lot of control over that. You had to press the shutter at the right time, but it's not a triumph of amazing lighting or particularly complicated camera
it's
technique.
that magic moment. But I think the competitions gave it the platform.
Yeah, got you.
To become well known. And I would say I just think that's an interesting one. There was a couple of other quotes. So, I mean, there's lots I could read out from these threads that I was going to. There was one I was just, I've lost it again now, as always. Jeff Halftog Loftus on Wetpixel contributed a lot to this.
Yeah.
And I think he's commenting on Steve's graph in particular, and he says, I think getting to good or admired is the best many of us can hope to do. There's some stuff about me I'm going to skip there. And then he says, from there on, I think there are so many factors that come into play, including, talent, hard work and practice, persistence, time in the water. And I think that is a really important aspect to it, is that, iconic images tend to be created by photographers who are there for those special moments. There's an element of stuff that happens out of your control.
Yeah.
And you're only going to get those opportunities with time as well.
Yeah.
You can put good photographers in the water and they'll have good pictures.
Yeah.
But you can't put good photographers in the water and they're always going to bring back those iconic pictures. There needs to be that circumstance to kick it off.
Yeah, and I think in many ways time is so critical, and I think we live in a society that increasingly wants everything, wants very quick results, and the reality is that experience, not just in terms of technical ability, but in terms of predicting how animals are going to react, being in the right place at the right time, being in traveling to places, all of that takes time and experience, and generally you increase your chances of producing iconic imagery, I think, by devoting time to it. I think there's no shortcut to that, I don't think.
And then there's another comment I wanted to read, which kind of just, diffuses some of the seriousness of it, as he often did. David Chin on Wetpixel, David Barrett, real life. Yeah. He says, unless we are pros, this is a hobby, and the ultimate target is having fun.
Yeah. And
I think David generally warns people not to feel that if you're not creating iconic images, you should be beating yourself up.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there was a lot of people who get really bad shots but enjoy it a lot.
Yeah.
And for them, those are winners.
Yeah.
So maybe, and he suggests that maybe we should have, if you are creating images that impress yourself, please yourself, then you are being successful. Yeah. And I think he warns that Steve's graph, perhaps makes you feel that you're, if you're not at the top of it, you should be beating yourself up.
Yeah.
And I think David's point is a nice way to round it out by saying, ultimately, for most people, underwater photography is something to be enjoyed.
Yeah.
And if you are creating images that are better than you thought you ever could, then you should be happy with that.
Yeah.
And I was at my parents' house recently, and on the bookshelf there is an underwater photo book I had when I was a kid. And that book, I remember looking at it as a kid and looking at the pictures in that book and wondering if I'd ever be able to take one picture that's as good as any of the pictures in that book.
Yeah.
And I looked at that book the other weekend, and I would delete every single picture on that book now. And it's funny how and that's not because of my ability. That's just the passage of time, the movement of goalposts in underwater photography.
Yeah.
But I think that if I was able to show 10-year-old me just one of the photos I've taken now, 10-year-old me would be very excited about the future. And I think that's what's great about underwater photography, the enjoyment that comes from improving and exceeding your expectations, wherever you are on Steve's graph, is very fulfilling. And I think that is that's what David is talking about there.
One of the points you make on your workshops a lot, Alex, and certainly you make in your book, and I think it's very true, is to give yourself the permission to experiment. If you're constantly chasing this iconic image goal, I think you become quite blinkered and actually going out and making mistakes. You need to learn. You need to look at things. Well, that didn't work. That's fine. Move on. It's not every image you're going to produce is going to be graced with the title iconic, and that's part of the process.
If you're not prepared to experiment, you're unlikely to break the new ground that's actually required to create those images. So
absolutely,
not only is it you shouldn't feel the pressure. I actually think if you want to reach those heights of creating something that brings something fresh to our world, you're not going to make that omelette without breaking a few eggs on the way.
Quite true. I think hopefully we might persuade you. There's some wonderful old threads on the forum. They're both interesting but also entertaining. There's some real laugh out loud moments. So if you haven't done so yet, it's worth a trawl through. Pick a subject that interests you, put it into the search bar, and see what you get back. Because you'd be amazed at some of the responses.
Or just search for Steve Williams.
Search for Steve Williams. Yeah, that's the other way. Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks very much, Alex. That's been a wonderful discussion. Bit of a blast down memory lane. And thanks again to Backscatter for sponsoring this episode. We really appreciate the support, as we do with all our sponsors. Thank you to all for watching, and possibly this is something that we could develop a new thread on the Wetpixel forum about what development makes for an iconic image, and we can tease this out into another discussion, which would be great. Please feel free to drop us a like if you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you again soon.